Good evening, everyone. Hello. Thank you for joining us. Hi, everyone. Just wait a couple of minutes while everybody starts rolling in here. So bear with us for a moment there. I can see the numbers going up nicely. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Right. Started to slow down now, so I think we're probably just about ready to kick off. So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to what is the final instalment, for a little while at least, of the Naturetrek online roadshow. So this evening we will be speaking to you about African wild dog conservations and the highlights of Botswana. So my name is Georgie Dodds. I am Naturetrek's tailor-made manager. And with that, I have the delightful job of basically being able to tailor-make any holiday you might like that involves wildlife. And as part of that, we can focus on specific species that are of particular interest to you, such as African wild dogs. So obviously, we can't guarantee anything with nature. But we will do everything we can to put you in touch with the very best naturalist guides. We'll put you in the very best area and use all of our expertise to try and help you with that. And obviously, we have lots of group departures to Botswana and in search of African wild dogs as well. And hopefully, we'll inspire you with a bit of that this evening. So I will also introduce you to my colleagues Ben Chapple and Jan Fox, who will be delivering our presentations this evening. So starting with Ben, Ben was previously a full-time member of office staff at Naturetrek HQ, but now he's moved on and is working with the research team at ZSL, and particularly in the wild dog team there. So we really couldn't ask for anybody better to join us this evening to really be sort of at the cutting edge of African wild dog conservation. And I personally can't wait to hear what Ben's got to say. And then after about sort of 30-40 minutes, we'll pass over to Jan Fox, who works with me in the tailor-made team at Naturetrek. So Jan grew up in Kenya, so East Africa is an area that he knows particularly well. But this evening, he'll actually be talking to us about Botswana, which is an area that he has recently visited on a recce trip. And hopefully that will tie in quite nicely with Ben's talk on wild dogs as well. Then towards the end of the evening, probably around 9 o'clock, we will end with a sort of Q&A session. Although please do feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A throughout the evening. We'll answer as many of them as we can as we go along. But then obviously I'll put those questions to Ben and Jan to hopefully answer in more depth as well. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Ben, who will teach us all about wild dogs. Welcome, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. Good evening, everyone. So as Georgie said, my name is Ben. I used to work full-time for Naturetrek, but I'm now based at the Zoological Society of London, where I am in the wild dog team, and I'm hopefully not too far away from finishing my PhD on the species, for which I've done quite a bit of field work in Kenya. I'll talk a little bit about that later. Now, for my part of this evening, I'm going to start by giving you a bit of an overview of the species, wild dogs in general, a bit about their ecology, their behavior, some of the threats that they face in the wild. I'll then move on from those to discuss some of the research that and especially actually some of my colleagues at ZSL, I'm really representing them here tonight. Some of them are doing some really fascinating stuff that's beyond even what I'm capable of doing, and how some of that research is being used to protect the species. So, if I can get the slide to move on, there we go. So this is the animal best known as the African wild dog. It does have several alternative names, some of which you may have heard yourselves. Those include Cape hunting dog and painted wolf. Painted wolf is actually the literal translation of the animal's scientific name, which is Lycaon pictus. Although more romantically, perhaps, Lycaon was also a king of Arcadia in Greek mythology, who cooked and served his own son to Zeus, and as punishment was transformed into a wolf. So it's quite an interesting scientific name. But there is, in fact, quite a lot of controversy around which name is best and by what name the species should be called. Some people suggest that the name wild dog doesn't really do justice to this extraordinary animal. And in fact, when I tell people who aren't familiar with the species that I work on wild dogs, often I get people wondering why it is that I'm studying feral domestic dogs. The name has also been associated with their treatment as vermin across a lot of their range. So actually in quite a lot of national parks, even for the first few decades of their establishment, wild dogs were deliberately killed by conservationists because they were considered a pest species that decimated antelope populations and got in the way of so-called real conservation. And that name wild dog is still in some ways associated with that slightly vermin status. So some would say that a more majestic name, something like Painted Wolf, is more befitting of their extraordinary biological uniqueness. And it's also possible, I think, that this slightly uninspiring name of wild dog might partly be responsible for them not getting the same level of adulation, the same level of attention as some of the more traditionally glamorous large African carnivores, which, as far as I'm concerned, is an absolute travesty because I think the species is at least as fascinating as any of the other typically more famous species like lion, leopard, and cheetah. However, having said all that, African wild dog is still the name that is most often used both in the field and by scientists working on them. So for the purposes of this evening, that is the name that I will continue to use for them tonight. So wild dogs are, as the name suggests, a member of the Canidae, the dog family. Now, this family includes a lot of the species you can see here, amongst others. In the past, they were thought to be only very distantly related to the true dogs. These are members of the genus Canis. Again, Canis lupus, the grey wolf, Canis familiaris, the domestic dog, also other species here like coyote and golden jackal. Recent genetic work, however, has shown that although they are still quite distinct from this group, they're actually more closely related to these Canis species than they are to the two species of African jackal, the black-backed jackal and the side-striped jackal. Now, both of those jackal species used to be nestled within or considered to be within the Canis genus. And so this finding means that either wild dogs would have to be moved from their previous genus, Lycaon, into Canis, alongside wolves and coyotes and these jackals, or the jackals should be moved into a new genus. And that's because, in evolutionary biology, one genus should be made up of species that are all more closely related to each other than they are to any species that's outside of that genus. Now, happily for those of us who think that Lycaon pictus is a really wonderful and distinctive scientific name, the jackals were transferred into a separate genus, Lupulella, another wonderful word, which means little wolf in Latin. Now, the African wild dog is listed as endangered by the IUCN. There are an estimated 6,600 individuals left in the wild across Africa. Now, before the European colonization of the continent, African wild dog populations would have been in the hundreds of thousands. So the number today represents a pretty catastrophic decline across, especially the last century. This map that you can see here shows the historical distribution of the species. As you can see, it was widely found across all of sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception really only of the Congo Basin rainforest. And it's actually thought that wild dog range in the past might have encompassed habitats that they today aren't able to occupy. So they would have been found right up to the top of some of the highest mountains in Africa, and again, only really absent from the densest rainforest and the very, very driest of deserts. You can see down in the southwest, that coastal strip of Namibia along the Namib Desert may well have been the only region of southern Africa dry enough to keep them out. This map here shows a similar kind of situation, but in a bit more detail. And this also shows in red where the species is known to be found today. So wild dogs have been extirpated from at least 93% of their historical range. And those 6,600 remaining individuals, those are split between 39 different subpopulations in 14 countries. So they're really split up, really fragmented. And the picture becomes even starker when you realize that only 1,400 of those 6,600 dogs are considered to be mature breeding individuals. So the rock on which a population is based, and really the most valuable individuals from a conservation perspective. So this is a really tiny, tiny number, and no single one of the remaining populations has more than 250 mature individuals remaining. So it's really in a very precarious position. Now, wild dogs live in packs that generally average around 10 individuals, although even today some packs can number up to 40. There have been records in the past of up to 400, up to 100 individuals gathered together, again, at times when the species was much more numerous. It's unlikely, however, that those ever represented stable packs. More likely what was going on then is an example of a behavior that no longer happens in wild dogs, which would have been temporary aggregations that formed in response to huge, great herds of migratory antelope like springbok. You know, those herds don't exist anymore, and therefore neither do the wild dogs. But it was probably a similar situation to what you sometimes see with super pods of dolphins, for example, where many pods, individual pods, would gather together to follow huge shoals of fish. And probably something like that used to happen with wild dogs. It's a sad situation that we no longer live in a world where that occurs. Now, within each pack, there is an alpha male and an alpha female, and these are almost always the only individuals in a pack to breed. So the other individuals are basically frozen out from the potential for reproducing while that alpha pair still survives. Now, the alpha female, this is a picture of an alpha female. You can see she's got really enlarged nipples, really enlarged teats on her underside, which shows that she's got pups that are suckling. Alpha female usually will give birth to a litter of between 5 and 15 pups. This is the largest litter size of any canid. Once those pups are born, although they will only usually be the offspring of the alpha pair, all of the rest of the pack will help to raise them. And in general, wild dog pups are extremely well looked after. They're even allowed to eat first at kills until they're a year old. Now, as only the alpha pair in a pack will breed, if pups want to get reproductive opportunities of their own, they need to leave the pack to start their own with unrelated individuals. And this normally happens with pups when they're between 1 and 2 years of age. They disperse in single-sex groups, so usually groups of sisters leaving together or groups of brothers leaving together. The most typical way that a new pack will be formed is when an unrelated group of sisters and an unrelated group of brothers meet up somewhere and form a new pack. Now, this is an image of a very young wild dog pup, barely old enough to be emerging from the den. Now, I took this photo in Botswana a few years ago. In southern Africa, den sites are very often in abandoned aardvark or warthog burrows. And they're often at ground level, so they can be quite accessible. In Kenya, however, especially in the area where I've done most of my work, getting a picture like this would be almost impossible because the dens tend to be high up amongst sort of rocky, inaccessible areas where you simply couldn't get unless you were on foot. And going there on foot would cause so much disturbance to the dogs that it's never worthwhile. Now, one very widely quoted fact about wild dogs is that they are Africa's most efficient predator. And the statistic is often quoted that something like 80% of their chases end in kills. Now, they are certainly very efficient hunters, but this 80% figure is probably a bit misleading because it's based on studies of wild dogs hunting large prey in very open grassland environments. Now, because wild dogs have such incredible endurance, they can chase down prey over vast distances if they have to. And they also have superb cooperation between pack members. Once they have a prey species or prey individual in their sights in an environment like this, it's very hard for it to get away. Um, and this is a still image from one of the recent BBC documentary series that showed this example, this kind of wild dog hunt, long chases in open grassland. And although this is typically what documentary makers want to film because they think it's the classic wild dog behavior, this open grassland is actually a pretty atypical habitat for wild dogs. And that's at least in part because these open habitats often have very high densities of lions and spotted hyenas. Wild dogs actually tend to be more numerous in denser bush, where chasing prey is a bit more complicated, it's easier to give the wild dogs the slip. So as I said, that 80% figure is probably an overestimate. Nevertheless, their success rate is absolutely much higher than that of most other carnivores. They are what's known as cursorial hunters, and that means that as opposed to ambush predators like lions and leopards, they don't really rely on the element of surprise, instead using that extraordinary endurance to outlast and run down their prey. Now, across most of their range, it's medium-sized antelope like impala, that's impala in the top left, that are the most important prey species. Smaller species like dik-diks, that top right picture is a Gunter's dik-dik from Kenya, and hares sometimes as well, and those can be important in some areas. They have been known to bring down prey as large as African buffalo, and in certain areas, especially in South African private reserves, wild dogs have actually learnt how to drive prey against fence lines. And this enables them to tackle much larger antelope, things like greater kudu in the bottom right, much larger things than they would typically be able to hunt without the assistance of that fence line. Now, before wild dogs set off hunting, they usually perform this really energetic and absolutely enthralling routine known as rallying, where they all wheel around greeting each other with all these excited squeaks and whistles. It's really very exciting to watch. But some research from Botswana a few years ago suggested that they also give little sneezes while they're doing this, which even more amazingly seem to act as votes. So these researchers claim in their study that the more individuals that sneezed during these rallies, the sooner the pack would set off hunting. But it didn't seem to be a true democracy because apparently the alpha pair could override the decision of the lower ranking majority. So if the alpha pair want to go, the rest of the pack has to go too, whether they like it or not. Now, I mentioned that they tend to avoid areas with high densities of lions and spotted hyenas. And that's because those two species in particular represent a significant threat to wild dogs. Now, in places where wild dogs still coexist with lions, the big cats are usually the single biggest natural cause of mortality in wild dogs. Lions will kill wild dogs whenever they get the opportunity. Hyenas typically don't kill wild dogs, but they do frequently steal food from them, which is known as kleptoparasitism. Wild dogs exist in quite a delicate energy balance. They don't really get much surplus food. So even losing quite a small proportion of their kills to scavengers like hyenas can have a major impact on pack survival and reproductive success. Now, while other carnivores like lions and hyenas can have a detrimental impact on wild dogs, most of the threats, of course, that are driving wild dog population decline are, of course, associated with human activity. Now, the biggest of these, as for so many species around the world, is habitat loss and fragmentation. Now, as we saw earlier, wild dogs are now divided into 39 subpopulations, with no single one containing more than around 250 individuals. Now, wild dogs are particularly susceptible to habitat loss, even more so than other large mammals, because they require such huge areas to survive. An individual pack can have a home range of hundreds or even thousands of square kilometers, which makes them amongst the most wide-ranging of all mammal species on Earth, certainly terrestrial ones. Now, even in Africa, where a lot of these national parks are effectively the size of small countries, there is only a tiny, tiny number of protected areas that are large enough to support viable wild dog populations. Now, wild dogs do face many other threats, but these are all linked to and exacerbated by, often, by habitat loss. Now, because only the alpha pair breeds, this effectively reduces the population size and makes them much, much more vulnerable to inbreeding depression. Again, especially when you have very small isolated populations. Wild dogs are also pre-programmed to avoid inbreeding as much as possible. And actually, this can be a real issue because it sometimes means that in small fragmented populations, there are no individuals that are distantly related enough that wild dogs would breed with them, would breed with each other. So actually, this inbreeding avoidance behavior can actually lead to the extinction of wild dog populations even before the inbreeding itself actually gets them. And of course, as wild dog habitat shrinks, packs also come into contact more regularly with people and with their livestock. Now, although wild dogs actually rarely hunt livestock when sufficient wild prey is available, and they will do so when there are no alternative food sources. And this, understandably, can lead to retaliatory persecution from some of these pastoralist communities. Wild dogs are also highly vulnerable to being caught in snares, which are usually set by poachers to catch other species, usually things like antelope for food. But perhaps an even bigger threat to wild dogs is disease. Now, livestock in particular are often accompanied by domestic dogs, which can be a reservoir of diseases like rabies and canine distemper virus. These can completely devastate wild dog populations, extraordinary speed. It's really shocking. So one particular example of this came in Laikipia County in Kenya in 2017. And this is the wild dog population that the lab group I work at ZSL is primarily associated with. Now, 2017 saw catastrophic droughts across East Africa, which drove a lot of pastoralists south through Laikipia from areas further north in search of water and pasture for their animals, particularly their cattle. Now, their domestic dogs all came with them, and these seem to have transmitted canine distemper virus to the region's wild dogs. And now this Laikipia population had been one of the biggest remaining in the whole of Africa, several hundred individuals. But once canine distemper virus had made its way into these dogs, the entire population was wiped out within a few months. Or so we thought. Just a single female, it turned out, survived. A few months later, my supervisor actually was picked up the signal from a collar that had been the collar of this dog you can see here, this one surviving female. Now, because none of the other dogs had survived, it was thought that this might just be they would find the body or perhaps just the collar left behind. But instead, against all odds, they found this surviving individual. And even more amazingly, the next year, two unknown males, nobody knows where they came from, appeared. They hadn't been known to the project before, so they weren't part of that population. And they appeared with her, and they formed this sort of fledgling new pack, which was nicknamed the Phoenix Pack, because, of course, it would hopefully help the wild dog population to rise up out of the ashes. They did produce pups, and although, again, the population is clearly very vulnerable to inbreeding, there is now some hope that this could form the basis of a proper recovery across Laikipia. There are now more dogs in the area. It still has some way to go before it can reach the heights that it reached pre-2017. And again, this emphasizes just how devastating disease outbreaks in wild dogs can be. Now, this is a good moment to transition more into some of the work that my ZSL colleagues are doing to try and protect wild dogs. Now, in Laikipia, and this is a picture taken from Laikipia, a big part of the job is simply monitoring the movements of the dogs that remain in the landscape. And this is done using both radio and satellite collars. This is a landscape that has a huge amount of human activity. And life here is not easy either for the dogs or for the people who live in Laikipia. So by keeping track of the Phoenix Pack and some of the other wild dogs that are generally or slowly moving back into the area, we can see how they interact with people and with livestock in the region. And that understanding the dynamics of those interactions can help us to work out how best to address human-wildlife conflict, protecting the dogs and also the livelihoods of the pastoralist farmers who have to live with them. Now, in Laikipia and in some neighboring regions of Kenya, my colleague Dedan Ngatia has been coordinating a rabies vaccination program for domestic dogs. If you can eradicate or at least vastly reduce the incidence of rabies in domestic dogs, this should, well, ideally eradicate, but hopefully enormously reduce the probability that rabies is transmitted to wild dogs. Now, this is Dedan here on the left. I think this is an absolutely fantastic picture of him, sort of smouldering next to a wild dog in the background. Dedan is the first Kenyan ever to do a PhD on African wild dogs. He's an incredible expert on the species. And when I was out in Kenya doing fieldwork of my own, he was absolutely invaluable in helping me find the species and get good data on them. He visited me in London last year, and I thought I should try and return the favour by helping him track down another wild canid myself. This is a terrible photograph, but I did manage to find him his first ever red fox, which was going through the bins outside my North London flat. Almost as good as tracking down wild dogs in Kenya, I'd say. Now, although I mentioned there is this rabies vaccine that you can use on domestic dogs, it's very cheap, so you can use it on big numbers of individuals. There is currently not an effective canine distemper virus vaccine that you can use on wild dogs. But we hope there will be soon because another ZSL colleague of mine, Maddie Rubin, who's from Botswana, is running a vaccine trial in Kruger National Park. And again, if that is successful, this really could be a game changer because if you can vaccinate wild dogs specifically, you ought to be able to remove the possibility of anything like that 2017 outbreak in Laikipia happening again, which would be fantastic news for their conservation. It could really be a game changer. Now, another perhaps less obvious threat, but one that could prove fatal for wild dogs, is that of climate change. Now, the impact of climate change on wild dogs has been a major theme of the ZSL research group's work over the last 5 to 10 years. And of course, this is referred to as the Hot Dogs Project. Now, as most warming is projected to occur in temperate and polar regions of the planet, tropical species like wild dogs have traditionally been considered less vulnerable to climate change. But still, there were some early indications that this species might be vulnerable to a warming planet, particularly that where the species exists away from the equator, it tends to breed only at the coolest times of year. So this suggested that temperature could be an important factor in the species ecology. And sure enough, analysis of long-term data on wild dog survival and breeding success showed that they have higher mortality and lower breeding success when temperatures are persistently high. So basically, they die more and they have fewer surviving pups when it's hotter. Now, this is obviously worrying. Climate change is not going to get any better anytime soon, but it's not immediately obvious why rising temperatures should be so bad for wild dogs. And if we are to have any hope of addressing the threat of climate change to the species, then we need to know what's actually causing this negative demographic effect on the species at higher temperatures. So one of the thoughts that we initially had was that higher temperatures might alter the behavior of prey species like impala, and that this somehow might make them harder to hunt. So some of my own earlier research looked into this question. So I used tracking data for wild dogs and for some of their most common prey species to look at how they each respond to changing temperatures. But what we actually found was that antelope seemed to move into areas that wild dogs preferred hunting in higher temperatures. So this ought to have made life easier for the dogs. So actually, given that life is harder for them at higher temperatures, this mechanism can't be what's going on. So an alternative idea is that the heat has a direct physiological impact on the dogs. When it's hotter, they simply overheat more quickly and can't hunt for as long. And some of my colleagues have placed collars that actually track wild dog activity that can tell how, not just where they are, but how fast they're moving and how fast their metabolism is running. And they've collected some quite good evidence for this idea that it might be a direct physiological impact. So on hotter days, wild dogs spend less time hunting. They hunt at shorter windows of time in the morning and late afternoon. That probably means that they're able to catch less prey on hotter days. They're also more active at night after hot days, which is probably a compensation mechanism. So if it's too hot during the day to hunt, they can't get food, but they still have to eat something. So they have to go out at night at a time when they're not well adapted hunting. Um, they normally avoid hunting at night, both for that reason of not having good night vision, but also because night is when lions and hyenas tend to be most active. So if higher daytime temperatures forcing wild dogs to spend more time hunting at night, then it's likely they'll have more negative encounters with hyenas and lions. So lions killing them more often, hyenas stealing more of their food. So this could be part of the explanation for why wild dogs overall seem to do badly when temperatures are persistently high. Now, so there's some more research that some of my other colleagues are doing at the moment, which is seeking to answer this question for good, trying to link higher temperatures directly with food intake and thermal heat stress as well, using data loggers, thermal data loggers actually implanted inside the dogs. Now, there's some interesting evidence as well from Kenya that wild dogs actually switch their prey preferences when it's hotter. So this is a Gunter's dik-dik again. Dik-diks in general are these tiny, often very, very abundant antelope. They're less nutritious, but much more readily encountered because of their abundance than larger, more profitable prey like impala. When it's hotter, wild dogs seem to eat more dik-diks than usual, which means they can reduce the amount of time they need to spend searching for prey. It's not hard to find dik-diks, they're all over the place. Now, this behavioral change, this switch to a more abundant prey species, could help to mitigate some of those climate change effects on the species, on wild dogs. However, in most parts of wild dog range, there is no similarly suitable alternative small prey species, so this might just be a unique case to Kenya. Now, regardless of exactly why climate change has these effects, it does seem to be bad news for wild dogs. Now, as a lot of the warming that's projected to occur is already effectively locked in, we're not going to stop climate change from progressing in the near future. The negative impacts of climate change on wild dogs may to some extent be unavoidable. But warming isn't projected to be uniform across Africa. There are some areas that are projected to experience more warming than others. By identifying the parts of wild dog range that are likely to be least affected by climate change, we can focus conservation efforts on those areas, and on those areas in particular that offer the best long-term hope for wild dog survival. Now, one of those areas, you can see on the right-hand side here, is the Tsavo National Park complex in Kenya, which is a vast reserve that currently supports relatively few wild dogs. And ZSL has recently started working in the park, aiming to ensure that it can become a sustainable stronghold for wild dogs long into the future. That's sort of the positive end. Unfortunately, however, the area of Africa that seems to be most likely to be severely affected by rising temperatures actually almost perfectly coincides with the largest remaining wild dog population. That's this Kaza transborder region centered on northern Botswana, which Jan is going to talk to you about later. That area is really vulnerable, which is very, very worrying for wild dog conservation. Another priority area, mostly because the dogs that live there are so geographically isolated from other dogs, is Senegal in West Africa. You can see on that tiny map of Africa on the top left, highlighted in red, where Senegal is. And on this larger map, highlighted in the blue checks, is Nyokolo-Koba National Park. Now, see, this reserve is very close to the Gambia, which is that thin white strip that extends through the bottom of Senegal. Now, Naturetrek runs some highly successful tours to Gambia, mostly focused on birds. But maybe if any of you here tonight are going on one of those Gambia tours and get really inspired, and you want to give the Naturetrek TaylorMade team a bit of a challenge, you could ask for them to send you on an extension to Nyokolo-Koba. It's a fantastic park, although the chances of seeing wild dogs, as you're about to find out, might not be particularly high. Now, this reserve, Nyokolo-Koba, is thought to be home to the last wild dogs in West Africa. But remarkably, they've received almost no attention up until now. Now, all we knew until a few years ago was that wild dogs were occasionally sighted in more remote areas of the park, but exactly how many there were, whether the population was stable or declining, or even breeding at all, was basically unknown. And that's where my colleague Angelo Pupa came in. Angelo is here, second from the right, and he is now the head of the ZSL West African Wild Dog Project, based in Nyokolo-Koba. He works with an incredibly dedicated team of Senegalese rangers, some of whom you can see here in this photo. Now, as I say, you can't conserve something effectively if you don't know where it is, how many there are, and what the threats that are facing it are. So the first crucial step that Angelo and his team took when they started their project was a massive camera trapping survey, which would assess not only the status of wild dogs in Nyokolo-Koba, but also the status of other mammals that live there. Some of West Africa's last lions live in this park, for example, also roan and giant eland, but also the extent of human encroachment inside the protected area. Now, this map shows where all of the camera traps in the park were deployed. This park is over 9,000 square kilometers. It's a very, very large park, and there are barely any roads that go through the reserve. So setting out all of these camera traps, especially because they needed to do it in this regular grid pattern, took weeks and weeks and weeks of trekking through very dense bush, often in very, very harsh conditions. The dedication of these guys is really extraordinary. Now, one of the great things about doing camera trap work on wild dogs is that each individual has a completely unique coat pattern. So with enough camera trap coverage, you can quite easily estimate how many dogs are out there in the depths of Nyokolo-Koba. Now, it seems from his early results that there may be 3 or 4 packs of wild dog in the park. This is obviously a picture of one of them. It's not a particularly good photo, but still, it's very clearly shows an African wild dog. Now, that population of 3 or 4 packs does appear still to be breeding, which is good news. And certainly this is a higher number than we had initially thought might be there, but it's still precariously low. And human activities, including poaching and illegal livestock grazing, were also found through these camera traps to be penetrating deep, deep, deep within the core of the national park, potentially meaning that none of these surviving dogs are free from the influence of human-induced threats. Now, it's obviously still very early days with this project, but if these wild dogs in West Africa are to have any hope, then it'll be as a result of some of this information collected by the ZSL team in Senegal, by Angelo and his colleagues. Now, this is another image that Angelo captured of Senegalese wild dogs. These wild dogs are certainly very geographically isolated, but it also seems likely that they are highly genetically distinct too. Now, wild dog genetics is another key area of research in the wild dog group at ZSL. Traditionally speaking, there were 5 subspecies of wild dog recognized across Africa. Those are the Cape wild dog, East African wild dog, Somali wild dog, Chadian wild dog, and then West African wild dog, which should be what these Senegalese ones are. However, that subspecies designation is very old, and it was largely based on their coat patterns and also some other fairly superficial characteristics that we now know are extremely variable within populations. So actually, this is not a good way of deciding that there are multiple subspecies. So it's actually very uncertain at this stage whether you can divide wild dogs into subspecies at all. Perhaps they're all one subspecies, and they're all, although they have variations in appearance, they might actually genetically be effectively identical. Now, why does that matter for conservation? Well, if you look at this map again, you can see that although there are many areas from which the species has been extirpated, areas where it no longer occurs, quite a few of these areas highlighted in blue, represent areas where the species doesn't currently occur, but potentially could recover under the right circumstances. Now, because of habitat fragmentation, it's very unlikely that those areas could be recolonized naturally by dogs from existing populations. So reintroduction probably offers by far the best option if wild dogs are to come back. Now, this is where genetics can be absolutely invaluable in providing guidance. If wild dogs from across the whole of their former range are essentially genetically identical, then it doesn't matter where you get dogs from when you're reintroducing them into perhaps a very different part of Africa. But if there are regional subspecies, or what we might call evolutionarily distinct units, so dogs from one area really are very different from another, then it would be inappropriate to take dogs from one part of Africa and transplant them into a completely different part. Not least because they may well have local adaptations to their particular environment that would mean they wouldn't be successful somewhere else. And this is especially important at the moment because organizations like African Parks, which some of you may have heard of, they manage a lot of national parks in areas of Africa where national governments don't have the resources to manage them properly. They're very keen on the idea of reintroducing wild dogs from South Africa, where there is effectively a surplus of wild dogs because conservation measures have been so successful, into places like Garamba National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, I think we would all like to see wild dogs return to that part of Africa, but it has to be done in an appropriate way. So this kind of work, and especially work that's being done by my colleague Amelia Ramage, she's doing genetic work on wild dogs from museum specimens from across Africa, and that's her on the left at one of these DNA labs at the Natural History Museum. Now, her work is trying to show conclusively whether or not those South African dogs would be ecologically suitable for reintroduction into Central Africa, or whether actually there's a better source population, perhaps East Africa. This is really important work that has a direct and obvious impact on conservation in the field. Now, finally, before I end, I just want to briefly mention some of the other work that I have been doing myself. So part of my research focuses on Maasai communities in Laikipia in Kenya. Now, if wild dogs are to be successfully conserved, it is obviously crucially important that the people they live alongside see them as an asset and not as a threat to their livelihoods. So one aspect of my research has been looking into what shapes the relationship between wild dogs and pastoralist communities. It's obviously a very complicated issue, and I could fill a whole evening with that subject. But for now, I'm going to leave you with one major finding that is relevant to Naturetrek and perhaps to all of you listening tonight. And that is that the one thing above all else that really does seem to encourage local people to be on board with wild dog conservation is tourism, and particularly employment through tourism. So where people see wild dogs as an attraction for tourists and where they get income from tourism, they are much more likely to tolerate and even support the presence of wild dogs. So traveling to see dogs, traveling to see wild dogs for yourself really can make a positive difference for the species. And on that note, I will pass you over to Jan, who I believe is going to talk to you about some of the ways that you might be able to see wild dogs for yourselves. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Yeah, really interesting talk. Really enjoyed that. Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm Jan Fox. I'm part of Naturetrek's tailor-made team. As Georgie mentioned, I recently moved to the UK from Nairobi in Kenya, where I spent 30 years and I was born and raised. So Africa is a continent that's very close to my heart. And tonight I'll be talking all about Botswana, which is one of Africa's top safari destinations. Now, I'm lucky enough to experience a 10-day safari to Botswana myself earlier this year, which was absolutely incredible. And so I'll start off by just giving a broad overview of the key wildlife areas across Botswana's northern safari circuit. And we'll then take a look at some of the existing and very exciting future tours that Naturetrek is planning to offer, including a wild dog focused itinerary. So first of all, where is Botswana? Well, it's in the heart of southern Africa, straddling the Tropic of Capricorn. And taking a closer look, you'll see that Botswana is bordered to the west and the north by Namibia and the Caprivi Strip, now also known as the Zambezi region, that narrow horn sort of protruding out of Namibia. Also to the north is Zambia, while to the northeast is Zimbabwe, and to the south is South Africa. And as you can tell from the large amount of beige on this map, the majority of Botswana's terrain is dry Kalahari sandveld. But the north is much greener thanks to the presence of the Okavango Delta and the various river systems up here. So there's a wonderful variety of habitats, from wetlands to large swathes of Mopane and Miombo woodlands. So yeah, naturally, most visitors are drawn to the northern half of Botswana, which is easily one of the best wildlife areas on the continent. I've only included a few of the main national parks and reserves here, but these are surrounded by a large number of private and community concessions. Now, it's important to bear in mind that many of these protected spaces are only separated by lines on the map. So much of northern Botswana is a huge continuous area dedicated to wildlife. And the animals can roam vast distances across these different ecosystems. A logical starting point for most trips is the massive Chobe National Park, which takes its name from the Chobe River that runs along its northern boundary. Chobe is best viewed as a handful of very different areas with distinctive vegetation and wildlife. The most visited and accessible section is the wonderful Chobe Riverfront, which is just a short drive away from the international airport in the border town of Kasane. Towards the end of the dry season, which is usually from around May to November, elephants and buffaloes gather at the Chobe and Linyati rivers in their thousands, with some arriving from as far away as Zimbabwe's Hwange National Park. And one of the main attractions of this part of the park is the opportunity to take boat trips on the Chobe River, which provides a very unique perspective of half-submerged elephants, pods of hippos, or basking crocodiles. And if you're lucky, you might see a few playful Cape clawless otters and spotted neck otters too. The Chobe Riverfront is also known for a wide range of antelope species, like this very well-lit puku. Waterbuck, kudu, impala, and reedbuck are all common here. And you've also got a good chance of spotting the rarer roan and sable antelopes, as well as the water-loving red lechwe. Keen birders among you won't be disappointed either along the Chobe River. The island and floodplain are particularly good birding spots, where you're likely to see many storks, geese, herons, egrets, and lapwings. And on the boat trips or game drives along the riverbank, you'll see various kingfisher species, cormorants, bee-eaters, hammerkops, and plenty of African fish eagles. Now, to the southwest of Chobe, about 170-kilometer drive from Kasane via the Chobe Forest Reserve, is Savuti, definitely my favorite corner of the park. There are many lodges in the area, so it's a fantastic location to spend a few nights in a mobile camp, immersed in the sights and sound of the bush. So this is what I'm talking about when I mean a mobile camp, which is a lot more comfortable than it sounds. The thick canvas tents are all sort of tall enough to stand in for most people, with comfortable beds and ensuite bathroom areas with bucket showers. There'll also be a large mess tent where you can relax and enjoy your meals. So when I visited Savuti in March, I spent a night in a mobile camp on the bank of the dry Savuti Channel, which is quite a mysterious feature of the landscape here. The channel has mainly been dry for the past 40 years, but it sometimes inexplicably flows, and nobody really knows why. When it does flow, like it did in 2009 and 2014, it begins in the Linyati swamps, meanders into the park, and then spills out into the Mababe Depression, forming the huge flat Savuti Marsh. Although the channel is usually dry, the rich soil and permanent waterholes attract plenty of elephants and plains game, which are inevitably shadowed by spotted hyenas, leopards, and lions. Like this cub that we stumbled across as the sun was setting on an evening game drive. And this was actually part of a pride of 15 lions. Savuti is actually famous for its large pride of lions, and at least one of the local prides has grown so big that they've even been known to prey on elephants. Continuing southwest, we move into the Kwai area, where the northern waterways of the Okavango Delta gradually narrow to form the Kwai River. As this is the eastern edge of the delta's waters, Kwai attracts huge numbers of thirsty animals from southern Chobe and beyond during the dry season. Naturetrek's Desert and Delta and Botswana's highlights tours include a few nights in a mobile camp in the Kwai concession, which is a reserve managed by the local Kwai people. And it's an excellent example of a local community helping to protect, conserve, and benefit from their wildlife. Now, an advantage of being based around Kwai is the option to enjoy game drives in both the community concession and across the Kwai River in the Moremi Game Reserve. The woodlands and the open areas on the fringes of the river are classic leopard territory. And some of the individuals here are particularly relaxed and used to the presence of safari vehicles. As Ben discussed in detail, Botswana is one of the best places on the continent to see African wild dogs, and you've got a really good chance of spotting them around the Kwai area. A number of packs are regularly seen denning close to the river and have been sighted with their pups. Again, as Ben talked about, wild dogs have enormous territories covering hundreds of square kilometers, but their population in northern Botswana is one of the healthiest in Africa. And as well as the Kwai and Okavango region, they range right across Kwando, Linyati, and the Chobe areas. Now, you're never guaranteed to see them, of course, but it's incredibly special when you do encounter them. Another bonus of staying outside of Moremi Game Reserve and in the Kwai concession is the opportunity to go on night game drives, which are not allowed in the national parks and reserves. So alongside your guide driving your safari vehicle will be a tracker holding a spotlight. And if you're very lucky, you might spot one of these guys, the very elusive aardvark. Now, I've only ever seen the backside of an aardvark scurrying down a hole in the Aberdares in Kenya, but you might have more luck than me in Botswana. More frequently seen on the night drives are the fearless honey badger, as well as crested porcupine, black-backed jackal, white-tailed mongoose, and spring hare. And a variety of interesting birds can also be looked for after dark, including the spectacular pennant-winged nightjar and giant eagle owl. Now, there's no better way to experience the wildlife on the bank of the Kwai River than in a mokoro, which is a dugout canoe traditionally carved out of a single tree trunk. Communities across the Delta still use the mokoro as an essential mode of transport, but it's also now a very unique and peaceful way for tourists to explore the waterways. Traditionally, these canoes would be carved out of trunks of hardwood trees like jackberries and sausage trees. But today, most safari camps use fiberglass mokoros that look very similar and function in the same way. The skilled mokoro guides have incredible balance, standing at the back of the canoes and propelling it forward using 10-foot-long wooden poles. Because you move through the water so quietly, you can get surprisingly close to the larger animals like elephants browsing on the riverbank or snorting pods of hippos. The inhabitants of the Okavango have been using mokoros in these waterways for many centuries, so elephants and other animals are usually quite relaxed. But your guides, are able to read their behavior and will always keep a safe distance. There are plenty of smaller creatures to appreciate on the rivers too, like this very small long reed frog, which is about the size of my fingernail. Now, the Kwai River is just one of the many waterways of the massive Okavango Delta, the largest inland delta on Earth and the highlight for most visitors to Botswana. It's an unspoiled wilderness of grassy floodplains, river channels, and thousands of seasonal forested islands, supporting an overwhelming abundance of wildlife. So, I mean, quite a confusing aspect of the delta is the fact that its water levels are usually highest through Botswana's dry season, from May to October. This is because most of the delta's water originates from rainfall in its main catchment area, in the highlands of Angola, which is around 1,000 kilometers away. And it takes months for this water to flow down through Angola and Namibia, and then spill into the northern Botswana. So this is where most travelers visit the Okavango when the water levels are high, and the wildlife congregates here as the desert dries out. Of course, there are lots of camps dotted around the ecosystem, and most around the heart of the delta are only accessible by air, which provides a spectacular view as you fly over the Okavango. Water-based camps like this particular one are located on small islands, surrounded by floodplains that are submerged for a large part of the year. So the activities they offer are usually on the water, including mokoro and boat excursions, but in-house guides lead bushwalks too. And game drives are also possible when the water levels are low or around land-based camps towards the edges of the delta. The density and variety of wildlife in the delta is just absolutely incredible. In the Moremi Game Reserve, with the reintroduction of the rhino, you can see all of the big five, so lion, rhino, elephant, buffalo, and leopard. And elephants and buffaloes occur across the ecosystem in large numbers year-round. Other species you're likely to see include blue wildebeest, impala, kudu, tsetsebe, giraffe, and reedbuck. And from the air, as you approach your camp, you might see large herds of red lechwe. Their splayed hooves are perfectly adapted for bounding through the delta's muddy waterways, while escaping lions, hyenas, or wild dogs. Of course, the Okavango is also hugely important wetland for many bird species. Pell's fishing owl, slaty egret, and white-backed night heron are particularly sought after. Now, in stark contrast to the lush Okavango are the vast open landscapes of the Kalahari's great salt pans. The wildlife is also rich here, but it's highly seasonal and nomadic. The pans are remnants of a huge 80,000 square kilometer super lake that once stretched up to what is now Chobe and the edge of present-day Zimbabwe in the east. It's thought to have formed between 2 to 4 million years ago, and only dried up within the last 10,000 years. Subsequent seismic shifts, climate change, and the diversion of rivers starved the lake of its water supply, creating the sparse, flat salt pans that exist here today. Although the pans themselves are barren and devoid of plant life, they're surrounded by vast grasslands. And on the western edge of Makgadikgadi Pans National Park, the seasonal Boteti River supports dense riverine woodland. In the late dry season, so from August to November, the Boteti region hosts tens of thousands of zebra and wildebeest, as well as various other plains game. When I visited the Boteti River a couple of months ago, it was absolutely full of life. Large herds of elephants and hundreds of wildebeest and zebras were drawn to the riverbed. And this waterhole was actually pumped by park authorities because the low levels of water of rainfall that particular year. Now, to the southwest of Makgadikgadi is the huge Central Kalahari Game Reserve. The reserve stretches well beyond the border of my map here. It's actually one of the largest game reserves in the world, covering a colossal 52,800 square kilometers, which is over twice the size of Wales. It's a vast sand sheet with wide open plains, a few salt pans, and the fossil remains of ancient riverbeds. Now, the best time to visit Central Kalahari is probably just after the wet season, which is usually from about December to April. Springbok in particular gather in large numbers on the grass plains shortly after the rains. And big herds of oryx can also be seen here, along with red hartebeest, eland, giraffe, and kudu. And tracking the herbivores are lion, cheetah, leopard, and spotted hyena. Central Kalahari and Makgadikgadi are also the best places in Botswana to spot these charismatic creatures, meerkats. Meerkats belong to the mongoose family, and they're usually seen scratching around for insects, beetles, and small reptiles. Another desert specialist is the bat-eared fox, which uses its large ears to listen for termites and other insects underground. Now, finally, I'd like to quickly mention Victoria Falls, which is not in Botswana, but it's very close to it. And it makes for a relaxing few days before or after a safari. Now, we always recommend spending 2 or 3 days in either Livingstone or the town of Victoria Falls. Both the Zambian and the Zimbabwean sides of the falls are worth visiting. And you can stroll through quite impressive rainforests sustained by the clouds of spray. The level of the flow varies throughout the year, and the volume of the water is highest at the end of the rainy season, around March or April, when the falls are at their most spectacular. But bear in mind that you're more likely to get drenched at the viewpoints. Now, one of our favorite lodges near Livingstone is Waterbury, where you can enjoy dawn or sunset boat cruises along the Zambezi, island picnics, bird walks, and plenty more activities. So how do you get to Botswana? Well, the easiest option from the UK is to fly via Johannesburg, where you can catch a flight to Maun to the south of Okavango Delta, to Kasane in the northeast by Chobe National Park, or to Livingstone if you're starting your trip at Victoria Falls. So Naturetrek currently offers a wide range of tours to Botswana, including Botswana's highlights, which is a wonderful 14-day tour of Chobe, Kauai, and Moremi. Botswana's Desert and Delta, which is focused on either birds or mammals around Kauai or Moremi. Botswana's Kalahari Desert, which involves 6 nights of mobile camping in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, and an epic 17-day tour combining Etosha, the Caprivi Strip, the Okavango, and Victoria Falls. Myself and the rest of the TaylorMade team would also be more than happy to put together a bespoke Botswana safari for you. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, we've also got an amazing wild dog focused tour in the pipeline, which we're aiming to launch for 2025. The majority of the trip will be spent exploring Moremi and the concessions around the Okavango Delta for these elusive but incredible creatures. If you'd like to register your interest, please drop me an email at jan@naturetrek.co.uk. And just very briefly, moving away from Botswana, we've also just launched a fantastic wild dog and melanistic leopard focus tour to Laikipia in Kenya, departing in September 2025. So this includes a few nights of the world-famous Laikipia Wilderness Camp, where you have the opportunity to track wild dogs and go on night game drives to search for rare black or melanistic leopards. There are 7 or 8 verified individual black leopards across the Laikipia ecosystem, including a relaxed female called Giza that is often spotted around Laikipia Wilderness Camp. You can find out more about this and others on our website, www.naturetrek.co.uk. And yeah, that's it for me this evening, everybody. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll hand back to Georgie for the Q&A.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you, Ben. Two really, really interesting talks. Yeah, very different, but learned so much from both of those. So thank you so much for your time. And also just to sort of mention what Jan was talking about there with the two extra wild dog tours that we're doing. We've also got Botswana, but I think one thing we didn't mention much of this evening is how well wild dogs can be seen in other places. For example, I was in the Sabi Sands in South Africa just last week, actually, when we got some great sightings of wild dogs standing there. So you can go there on our Just Cats tour, ironically, but we will focus on wild dogs as well if we see them. And Zambia is another fantastic place. South Luangwa, they're being seen more and more regularly. So if you ever do want to talk about any tours regarding wild dogs, do just give us a call in the office and we can chat to you about sort of which tours might work best for you. But obviously, we know how popular they are at the moment, which is why we're kind of working on this Botswana wildlife tour in particular. And Jan will be happy to speak about that. So sorry, that was just a bit of an aside. But on to the Q&A here. We've had a few questions that have come in this evening. So I think there was one for Ben regarding about the sort of subspecies of wild dogs that you were talking about earlier, and the work that's being done there. Is there a chance that they're sort of created by man-made isolated populations anyway? So yeah, should we be worrying about that really, or yeah,
it's a good point. I mean, yeah, definitely some of that isolation that you've got genetically is as a result of that habitat isolation, habitat fragmentation. You can often tell. I mean, I'm not a geneticist myself, but you can often tell through genetic methods how long ago two separate populations diverged from one another. So that would give you an indication of whether it's man-made activity that's caused this isolation. Something else that's also worth bearing in mind is you sometimes, if you were to introduce, so let's say you've got a small isolated population of wild dogs somewhere, and you're trying to bolster it with wild dogs from a very different part of Africa, you can sometimes get something called outbreeding depression. So we're probably all familiar with inbreeding depression, which is where individuals that are too closely related mate with each other, and that can cause problems. Actually, you can sometimes get a problem where individuals from two quite different populations produce offspring that might have intermediate characteristics for those two populations, and those offspring might be really badly suited for habitat that either of their parents exist in. That's one example of outbreeding depression. So even if, I hope that makes sense slightly, but even if these are populations or sort of subspecies that are created by man, you still have to be a little bit careful about how you address things like reintroductions when they're not closely related to each other.
Great,
I hope that
thank
makes
you.
sense.
Yep, no, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. So Ali's just asked about the email address for expressing interest in the Botswana Wild Dog Tour. So you can either email Jan directly. So his email address is just Jan, Jan, @naturetrek.co.uk. Or if you just email the info@naturetrek.co.uk, any of my colleagues will be able to help there. We'll send a little email after this as just a follow up. So again, just respond to that. And there's lots and lots of ways to contact us. Don't worry, we'll be in touch. So another question that we've had here is from Richard, who says again about the wild dogs. Can the new pups suckle off the siblings of the alpha female?
Typically, no. It's usually only the alpha female that would have offspring and then would therefore lactate. So what can very occasionally happen is that subordinate females can get pregnant. But what normally happens in that situation is the alpha female will kill those pups. In that situation, you will have another female that's lactating. So I suppose, although I'm not actually aware of any examples specifically, it's not impossible that that female might also suckle her sister's pups. What other pack members will regurgitate meat for the alpha pair's pups when those pups are old enough to eat meat. But yeah, generally speaking, they're not going to be suckling off anyone other than their mother.
Thank you, Ben. And just another one that's just come in. Jan was talking about Botswana, obviously a lot of detail there, but also went on to talk about the Victoria Falls and visiting from the Zambian and Zimbabwean side of the falls. On a holiday to Botswana, is that easy to do? Is there a lot of border control? Is that complicated? Or
Yeah, so we'll always recommend visiting both sides of the falls. It's actually quite simple to do. So if you're staying in Livingston, for example, you could quickly sort of cross the bridge into the Zimbabwean side, just sort of pay your visa there, explore that side of the falls, and then come back. So it's something that a lot of travelers do. It's very easily done. And it's something that I definitely recommend because there are very sort of distinctive sides to the falls, and it's worth seeing all sides of them. So very, very easily done.
Great, thank you, Jan. And obviously the two trips that you talked about at the end of your talk about Laikipia and also the Botswana wild dogs. Julie's asked whether they'll take place beyond 2025. I'm assuming that's just dependent on popularity and how well they go, and what we see. So
yeah. I mean, I'm sure they'll both be sort of very popular trips, and the plan is to run them every year from then. You know, so we'll sort of assess it on an annual basis and see how popular they are, or if they can go at different times of the year. But yeah, the plan's definitely for it to run beyond 2025 for sure.
Great, thank you. And another one just popped in from Catherine here. For Ben, when establishing the alpha status, are there fatalities in the fights often?
So that's a really interesting question too. What's really fascinating is that getting alpha female status and alpha male status actually typically requires slightly different things. So it's almost always the most senior, the oldest female in a pack that's the alpha female. Whereas actually the males do fight for alpha status. Fatalities are very rare though. They're pretty unlikely, pretty uncommon. Yeah, the males who are fighting are typically related to each other, so the incentive for kind of fatal competition isn't that strong. And what's much more common is fatalities to occur when two separate packs meet each other. Then actually fighting can be really intense. But yeah, generally speaking, they're not killing each other, getting alpha status.
Yeah, makes sense. Really interesting. Thank you, Ben. So I think that's pretty much all of the questions that we've had this evening. So unless anybody's got sort of anything burning they would like to add, I think we'll start to wrap up. So thank you so much again to our two panelists, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you again for joining us for our continued series of roadshows. We've loved bringing something a little bit different to you this time as well. So we will be back probably in the autumn or winter. If there are any topics that you would particularly like to hear about, then do get in touch. We're always sort of keen for new ideas and to keep things fresh. And we'll hopefully see quite a few of you at the Bird Fair from the 12th to the 14th of July. If you've got those in your diaries, we look forward to meeting you in person, hopefully. But if not, yes, we'll see you very soon. Do give us a call in the office. We love to chat about holidays and everything else. And yeah, we'll see you very soon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.